Hello, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today, we want to talk a little bit about the first farmers. How do we go from foraging, subsistence collection of wild plants, to actually growing and being in control of the plants and animals that we eat and use in our daily lives? First of all, we know from all of our conversations about foraging that nothing has changed. Ancient people needed to have a balanced diet, just like we do today. Although before you had to go out and just collect it, and so there was hunted meat and gathered nuts, plants, and fruits. And the idea was that people figured out over time what the best foods to forage were. And of course, we have lots of non-food uses for plants as well. And that can range from the oils and fibers to medicines, storage, tools, whatever. And I put these pictures in here. These are all ceremonial and decorative, but I think the idea that you're using plants and you're showing plants is really important about the cultural aspect, that cultural importance of plants. And here, these are pieces of jewelry, right? And they are old, and you're seeing all of these fruiting bodies of these plants, which is talking about this idea of prosperity and fertility. And then here, this is a gourd water drum. And then here's another gourd that actually tells a lovely story about hunting. Okay, so when we go from hunting to farming, first of all, it really is about the environment. Climate conditions change. There's a warming trend that follows the last ice age around 13,500 years ago. And so we start to see the earliest true agriculture around 12,000 years ago in Southwest Asia. By 9,000 years ago, it's everywhere, okay? Now, I will say that around 10,800 years ago, there's a cooling snap, like really abrupt, that's called the Younger Dryas, and that causes some changes. But immediately following that, when it starts to warm, this is where you start to see agriculture rising independently everywhere else. But it starts out in Asia, and then we'll talk about where it goes from there. Now, here's your first question. The line between food collecting and food producing is crossed when people begin to plant crops and keep animals. People begin to utilize leisure. People begin to eat whatever they find around them. People begin to domesticate, or there actually is no line. Well, it's very tempting to say when people begin to domesticate, but domestication occurs because people begin to intentionally plant crops. Domestication occurs as they start, one was the answer, as they start to manipulate and say, okay, here's a trait that I like, right? And we'll talk about that in just a second. We've been doing it for a really long time, and you can actually tell what cultures were food producers by the things that you find, specifically the plant and animal remains, but of course pictures help a whole lot. Here's your next question. The largest problem for a mobile hunter-gatherer in gathering a great deal of wheat grain in a short period of time is going to be what? Eating it, threshing it, having to store it, harvesting it, or planting it. Well, if you are mobile and you get a whole lot of stuff, you have to have some place to store it. You can't just carry it around, and that is not going to work out very well because you may find that you need to protect it from other animals, other people. And so we start to see this shift in this idea of planting things and collecting it and staying with those things that you plant, okay? So food production was not really the result of new discoveries about planting. People have been very knowledgeable about plants and animals, okay? And the other thing is domestication did not make life easier. The switch to food production actually increased the workload. And so when you're doing this, when you're raising crops, soil has to be worked, crops planted, pests controlled, the food has to be harvested, and then it has to be processed before you can eat it, right? And on top of that, you put all this work in, and it's risky, right? The crops could die because of weather, parasites, disease, something could come and eat it other than you. And so this is a huge thing. So why switch to this? Well, here's one of your next questions. With all the disadvantages to farming, why do humans continue to do so? Well, there's a number of reasons, but one of the big ones is that it actually allows you to have a reliable food source and for more children to survive, okay? It doesn't allow freedom to move when you want to because you're there stuck at your farm. Nobody got taller until fairly recently, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And it certainly doesn't decrease disease load, and we'll talk about that in a second too. Okay, so you get more food, more surviving kids, and that's a helpful thing. Okay. Now, there are different levels of domestication. We start out with this idea of unconscious selection for desirable traits. You say, okay, that is good. I like to eat it. I'm going to plant it. Then you start to say, okay, this one is better than the other one. I'm going to plant this one instead of that one. Then you start saying, okay, this one has traits I want, and that one has traits I want. I'm going to breed them and get better traits. And then, of course, we've taken that in the last couple hundred years to understanding the genetic mechanisms and being able to exploit that. And then, of course, now we're in the midst of the gene revolution where we're actually engineering these plants and animals. Okay, so what we're really talking about is artificial selection, and that is selective breeding. And you can do it two ways. You can do inbreeding or hybridization. And ultimately, inbreeding is the same organism, right? And you have one, which and another one, and these have traits you like, and so you get these desired characteristics from the original like species. In this case, you have two different species, dissimilar organisms, right, and you breed them together, which gives you hopefully the combined traits. And here's just a little like, I like this tall one here, I like the one with the big fruit, and so I'm going to breed them together and hopefully get a tall one with big fruit. Now, artificial selection has some problems. There's a reduction in the genetic variety, and it can result in inbreeding, which means that there are not enough good traits to cover up bad traits, and we'll come back to the reduction of genetic variety in just a little bit. Here's a fun fact. Many of the domesticated versions we have today can actually still breed with their wild types. Goats, sheep could, they don't really survive out there, dogs and wolves, things like that. Okay, so what are the desirable traits that we want in plants? Well, we're going to want anything that makes them not poisonous, bigger, right? Reach sexual maturity faster, and so we can get more food. We want something that's going to be predictable, okay? And we also want to reduce them sowing their own seeds, which is the reduction in shattering of fruits, by the way. So just right there, that's so we keep the seeds instead of having them spread out. And then what I just said encompasses all of these traits. Now, when we talk about shattering of seeds, we're really talking about these grain crops. And so when we find the archaeological record for the domestication of seed crops, it is better known than that for soft flesh crops because the latter does not preserve well. The latter is a hard part of a plant. The latter preserves well. The latter creates an implant, or we do know about them. Well, we don't. And it's because the soft flesh crops, right, your fruits and things like that, those do not actually preserve well. But grains do because they have a seed coat around them that helps preserve them. It's one of the reasons they store so long. It's why we like grains. Wheat is the first thing that we actually domesticate. And at least, wheat is the first thing we domesticate. And it's actually, when you look at domesticated wheat today, it's actually a combination of several wild types. And so there was a hybridization that occurred in the Fertile Crescent. And that version of wheat traveled out and spread out. And then there was a second hybridization that occurred around the Caspian Sea. And each time that happened, you ended up getting, so you get these guys, and then you get that. And then when the goat grasses come in, right, you get this nice big berry huge thing. But one of the interesting things that's happened is you've increased the ploidy, the chromosome number. And I think this is cool because plants really tolerate lots of changes in their chromosome numbers really well. And the grapes that you see today in the dining hall, the big fat yummy grapes, they're a product of this idea of increase in polyploidy. It's very simple. The more stuff you have in the cell, the bigger the cells have to be, the bigger the resulting fruits. Okay, so you might have heard of teosinte, also called teosinte, which is the more common name, and that is the wild ancestor of what? Well, not wheat, because wheat's the wild ancestor of wheat. Maize, manioc, squash, or tomato? Well, the answer is maize, corn. Teosinte, which is Central and South American, it looks like this, right? So this is the progenitor of corn, and over time, we started breeding it for the characteristics that we like, that we see in modern corn today. Okay, now this is a beautiful sunflower, banana, delicious, right? And a variety of wonderful carrots in wonderful colors. These are all things that we have made over time, and this is what wild sunflowers really look like. Tiny, they're all kind of clumped together on a single stalk. Not really what we want to put in our house, and they do not produce large sunflower seeds that we really like to eat. Banana, ooh, hard, seedy, not really good for eating. Not really what we want, so we've turned it into this delicious little guy up here. Cavendish is what this is called. And then that is the original carrot. Not a whole lot of eating going on, okay? And then, of course, there's cauliflower. Look at that. It now even comes in a variety of colors because we've bred it so that we get things that we like in it, and that gives us the fun colors. That actually comes from wild mustard, which is very closely related to the fast plants that we use in biology. And it's also a cousin of broccoli and cabbage and kale and kohlrabi, right? And so all of these things are related. They all arise from this, and we did all of that. As a matter of fact, we made broccoli in the 1600s. Now, what about other things? What about traits we get just because we like them? Yeah? We have all the weird pigeons. We have crazy goldfish. We have beautiful guppies with giant, non-survivable fantails. And, of course, we have cows that produce a ridiculous amount of meat. That's all meat, by the way, so they're very meaty. And we'll talk about animals later on. So which of the following regional plant domestication associations is incorrect? East Asia, coffee, cotton, okra, sorghum. Mediterranean, barley, celery, grapes, olives. Mesoamerica, beans, maize, manioc, squash. Southern and Southeastern Asia, papaya, potato, pumpkin, and tomato. Well, the answer is 4. None of those 4 things come from Southern and Southeast Asia, although rice does. Yeah. And so here's just a nice little table that shows you things that you find, right, all over the world and where they actually come from. Okay. In the New World, seed crops such as sunflowers, those are native to here, sumpweed and goosefoot were all domesticated in eastern North America long before corn, which came from India, long after corn, which came from Mexico, long before corn, which came from Mexico, or long before rice, which came from Mexico, or none of these. Well, corn comes from Mexico, and our Native Americans had domesticated all of those things long before corn, actually, which was introduced from Mexico. And so the answer is number 3. We have things that we had domesticated, because remember, domestication is occurring all over the world independently. Okay, and so here are some of the crop hearths. You can see that Mesoamerica produced all of these guys. Sunflowers are not listed because they're actually from up here. And then here's a lovely crop hearth, an agricultural hearth in Africa, and this is where you get rice and coffee and yams. And then over here you have that Fertile Crescent where you've got your barley, a couple of kinds of wheat, lentils, oats, rye, bread wheat, right, olives. And then over here in China you've got rice and soybeans, walnut, right, that's kind of exciting. And then over here in Oceania you've got the mango, coconut, right? These are some things that I imagine you would recognize. And then I also like this map because it shows a little bit more some of the things that were not mentioned on the other one. Here's the sunflowers and the peppo squash and things like that. And then I've put these in here so you can kind of see some of the origins of other things, right, and what they're actually used for. And so it's divided into cereals, pulses, roots and tubers, these are beans by the way, roots and tubers, oil crops, fruits and nuts, vegetables and spices, and then fiber plants, okay. Jute is what makes burlap, just as an aside. And then you can look at each of these as you go through. You should recognize belladonna, that was actually in your foraging activity. And then here's Africa, and again, you can look at this later. And then Mesoamerican and North American, again, you can look at this later. I'd know a couple from each area if I were you. And then here's South America. And then I like this map because this is actually the spread of agriculture. And you can see by 1000 BC, agriculture's everywhere, right? Everybody's doing it. Now, there is an ecological consequence, and that is the loss of diversity. Okay, when you start out, you have all these different wild species. We start to domesticate them. We get the ones that we like, and then we just keep breeding those. And so we end up being left with just the modern varieties. And that can be dangerous, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the Green Revolution and monoculture. But here is some evidence, actually, from chloroplast DNA, because remember, chloroplasts and mitochondria both have DNA. But you can look at the total lack of variety in your cultivated crops, right? These are the wild types, and these are the cultivated crops, right? And sunflower actually has almost none. Now, one of the advantages of the invention of agriculture for human adaptation is the elimination of disease, the ability to feed a larger number of people, the increase in biodiversity of plants, or the development of cities. Well, disease was not eliminated, and we know that we've lost genetic diversity. Cities, one could argue that could go either way, but it is the ability to feed a larger number of people and have more children surviving. So the consequences of population growth are that you have a reliable food source and a higher food density, but that gives you, did I say the consequences of agriculture? Let me try that one more time. The consequences of agriculture are population growth. I hope that's what I said. And then because you have a reliable food source and you have higher food density, which means you get more food per acre, per parcel of land, and so you can feed a lot more people. Now, there is a decrease in the quality of life. While you do have a steady supply of calories, a lot of times it's a more limited diet, and so you actually end up getting poorer nutrition. You have more sugar, like in things like maize, and fruits, and so you get a lot more cavities, right? So there are teeth issues, and the spread of disease just in general increases because you're in closer contact with people. People start to actually settle down. And some disadvantages, other than that, of the invention of agriculture are an increase in interpersonal violence, the lack of a surplus food supply, the inability of agriculture to feed a large number of people, or the specialization of skills. Well, we know we have a surplus food supply. We know we can feed a large number of people. The specialization of skills is not really a disadvantage, but there is an increase in interpersonal violence. Okay, and this brings us to the idea that agriculture leads to civilization. You need organization. You need to be able to survey land to know where to grow things, and you need to be able to keep records. What things grew, what were the yields, all of these things. And so you have this need for written language, right? You have this need for measurement, right? You have this need for systems that will allow for communication to occur. You also have all of these surpluses, right, of food, and there's a need for infrastructure and tools, and so you develop specialization of skills. People have specialized jobs. You get craftsmen and artisans and masons and farmers and, all of these different jobs, anything you can think of. And the infrastructure that we need is going to be transportation, and so wheels is a good one. Durable buildings. You need houses, you need barns, you need storage facilities, right? And you need farming implements, and those all have to be made. Of course, there is an increase in materialization. There's a want and a need for artifacts and trade goods, right? If you have a specialized skill, you're going to have to trade with somebody else to get the things that you need. But once you start getting things, most people end up wanting things, right? And so you start to have just things that material things that people buy, jewelry, decor, whatever, okay? Now, you also see the development of private property. Private property is going to be necessary in many cases because you're growing food for your family, and ultimately that's going to lead to a need to protect those food stores and whatever your animals are, which, like I said, we're going to talk about later. And so there is conflict, right? Somebody wants to take your stuff, you have to defend it, right? Somebody wants to farm on your land, you defend it. And so that is a little bit of a disadvantage there. Okay, now, here's your last question. Your friend shows you a magazine article that says that better nutrition is the reason modern Americans are taller than Americans of 2 centuries ago. You tell her that it's not true because the obesity epidemic has started to make Americans shorter. The truth is that we're far less healthy now than we were when agriculture first began. While this is true, other factors such as a reduction in infectious diseases also contribute to an increase in height, or you just agree completely. Well, number one is false, right? Obesity has nothing to do with your height, okay? And we are, in fact, much healthier now than we were before, okay? So that, I know the paleo diet indicates that that is not true, but it is true. We are more healthy. But other things, it is true that better nutrition makes people taller, and that is the main component, but also better medicine, better sanitation, things like that, allow for people to be healthier and to reach their maximum potential, if you will. All right, so that is it for today. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.